Hello, and welcome to the Educational Leadership Exchange podcast. I'm your host, Kristen Schmidt, and I'm very excited to welcome you to our very first podcast. Today on our program, we are privileged to have an interview with Justice Marvin Zucker. He is a practicing judge in Ontario, as well as an associate professor of education law at the University of Toronto's Institute for Studies in Education, commonly known as OISE. Justice Zucker sat down with me to discuss the role educators play in keeping children safe, on our duty to report to the Children's Aid Society, as well as giving some advice on dealing with bullying and professional negligence in education. We've got a loaded episode for you today. This is Educational Leadership Exchange.
When a child has been bullied or cyberbullied, his or her right to be free from violence has been violated.
Before we begin our interview with Justice Zucker, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself and about this podcast. I'm Kristen Schmidt. Right now, I work as an occasional teacher with the Ottawa-Carleton District School Board in Ottawa. I'm also a graduate of the Master of Education program at University of Ottawa, supervised by Dr. Stephanie Chitpin, who is an associate professor and founder of the Canadian Principal Learning Network Leadership Unit at the University of Ottawa. The Canadian Principal Learning Network Leadership Unit is also known as CPLN, so you might hear me refer to CPLN in that way a little bit later. This podcast has been produced by the CPLN Leadership Unit. If you like what you hear today, please send us your thoughts or questions at cpln@cpln.info. And without further ado, let's begin our interview with Justice Zucker. Justice Zucker brought up some very interesting points in terms of bullying and cyberbullying. Before we sat down to record the interview, I sent him some questions via email. In reference to bullying, I asked him, how can we be tough on bullying without being the bully ourselves? What's appropriate in terms of punishment? In the following clip, you'll hear him address these questions and much more.
Get into the issue of bullying and cyberbullying is the nexus. What is the relationship between what a student might put on the internet involving, say, another student? What is that nexus and the ability of that student to go to a specific school? Because, and that's why students may be suspended. What do you do? What do you do, for example, when I was sitting in youth court? If I get a youth charged with sexually assaulting another youth from the same school, do I send that youth back to the same school where the victim is? I make an order that say there's no contact directly or indirectly with the victim, but that may be impossible in a school. So I can make an order hypothetically that the youth go to a different school. So what if there's only one school in the area? So there's a lot of, but you have to respect the accused, but you also have to respect and protect the victim. You don't want anybody to be victimized any more than they already have been.
That is so true. Protecting the victim is so important, and Justice Zucker really puts that into perspective for us. A little later in the interview, Justice Zucker mentioned the psychological impact of bullying, and he talked specifically about cyberbullying.
So A Big Brag versus Brag Communications not only deals with bullying, and I'll spend a few minutes at cyberbullying, but it also deals with the United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child and the whole social media issue. And as I said earlier, it's a balance. You have to balance the right to protection from violence, sexual abuse, and exploitation. And again, you can go to the criminal code and deal with specific cases or specific offenses relating to a breach of trust. So on the one hand, you've got protecting individuals from sexual exploitation, sexual abuse, violence. On the other hand, the basis of maybe a positive basis of not cyberbullying, of the social media, and that's the right of freedom of expression and freedom of association. And as the Standing Senate Committee on Human Rights in a report on cyberbullying said, when a child has been bullied or cyberbullied, his or her right to be free from violence has been violated. If a child studies suffer or she fears going to school, her right to receive an education or develop to her full potential may have been violated.
I found that last point so important. Bullying violates a child's human rights. The right to be free from violence has been violated. But what do we do about the child who bullies? You'll hear Justice Zucker use the acronym IPRC in the following clip. IPRC stands for Identification, Placement, and Review Committee, and that is the committee that decides if a child should be identified as a special needs or with exceptionalities.
If a parent, if a child is out of control, a parent doesn't agree with an IPRC, then our courts have said, well, if the parent doesn't agree to an IPRC, the parent doesn't agree to the help that the school wants to provide or the board wants to provide, and a child continues to be a threat to other children, then you suspend the child, and then you have a right to expel. So, and again, as the Supreme Court of Canada, Justice Isabella in the Bragg Communications case said, there is no need for a child to demonstrate by means of an affidavit, sworn document, or expert evidence that he or she is subjectively vulnerable as a result of cyberbullying. Vulnerability is presumed. And again, Justice Isabella adopted the Nova Scotia's report definition of bullying. Behavior that is intended to cause or should be known to cause. And that's why the three words I always tell my students and principals should be aware of them when they're dealing with teachers or when they're dealing with pupils or when they're dealing with parents. Documentation, documentation, documentation. You want to, you may not have to refer to documentation if you're in a courtroom, but it creates credibility. I told somebody and I can refer to what I told them that they should do on such and such a time. Rather than somebody saying, well, you never told me, you never spoke to me, you never saw me. So, as Justice Isabella says, behavior that is intended to cause or should be known to cause fear, intimidation, humiliation, distress, or other forms of harm to another person's body, feelings, self-esteem, reputation, or property. Bullying can be direct or indirect and can take place by verbal, written, physical or electronic means or any other form of expression. So it covers, quite a number of bases.
Our interview with Justice Zucker was quite long and had a lot of excellent information. Because of this, we're going to break it up into a few different podcasts. This podcast focused solely on bullying and cyberbullying, but I'm going to leave you with an overview of what Justice Zucker had in our interview, as well as some information that he mentions. He mentions a website in the following clip that is CanLii, www.canlii.ca. In the clip, it sounds like he says .ci. It's really .ca. Feel free to look up statutes and cases in that database. It's so important. Anyway, here's some final thoughts.
It's critical that education professionals have an understanding of the legal regime It governs educational institutions in Ontario. Um, so hopefully our discussions will provide an overview of some of the important issues that involve educators, teachers, principals, students in an education law context in Ontario. One of the things that I tell my students at OISE is there is a website, www.canlii.ci, that allows anyone without cost to look up any statute of any province in Canada. So much of what we're talking about now can be found on the website. It's a student or teacher or a principal can download. And also cases. So any of the areas that we talk about, if you simply type in child abuse or type in the duty to report under Section 72 of the Child and Family Services Act, you will get cases covering these areas. Oh. So it's a great website that individuals usually use. So when we talked about the idea of podcasts, which I think is important to provide principals and others with legal information, and it isn't always necessarily knowing the law, but knowing where to go to find it out.
Yeah. As Justice Zucker just said, it isn't always about knowing the law, but where to go to find it out. Again, that website he mentioned is canlii.ca, CANLII.ca. In our last clip for part 1, Justice Zucker discusses an important classroom management strategy in dealing with bullies. Let's give it a listen.
So you want, whether it's the teacher or whether it's the principal, you want the leaders to promote positive peer experiences, because what happens is if kids are bullied and the principal or whoever's in charge doesn't do something about it, kids won't go to school. They're not going to be in school. They're going to be afraid to go to school. And I think the idea is, in some classroom management strategies, is to turn bystanders into upstanders. Now, what that means is, if you don't want people to be bystanders. If you see somebody bullying somebody else, you say something, you do something. So you be an upstander, not a bystander.
Thank you for listening to part 1 of our interview with Justice Zucker. If you're interested in listening to more of our interview, you can find part 2 on our YouTube feed. In part 2, we discuss the duty to report to the Children's Aid Society, and in part 3, we discuss professional negligence and the law around search and seizure, which may be especially interesting to principals. Special thanks to Dr. Stephanie Chitpin, head of the CPLN Leadership Unit at the University of Ottawa, and to Justice Zucker for agreeing to discuss these very important topics. If you want to get in touch, please send us an email at cpln@cpln.info. We're very interested for your comments and questions. Justice Zucker has kindly offered to answer any questions you may have. And so, if you've been listening and you have a few questions, you can email us again at cpln@cpln.info, and we will be sure to communicate your questions to Justice Zucker. Our music is called Pamjaya from imcomtech.com, and thanks again for listening. My name is Kristen Schmidt, and you've been listening to Educational Leadership Exchange.